This video will be about how to set default strategies for a team. And I think every team has experienced this at least once, where the default strat feels like it's too vague or too loose, or maybe someone makes the same mistake over and over but doesn't learn, or it just feels disconnected for a long period of time. And it's not acceptable, because that means it's essentially saying that there's a low consistency in terms of carrying out the best results possible. So when I talk about default strats, I mean the strategy that's your bread and butter basically for a map, and you want to have one default strategy per map. It doesn't have to be different from all the other maps. If it works on every map, then why not run it on every map? But you wanna be able to rely on something. Like Rogue relied on dive, like NYXL relied on the playstyle around playing around J. Jonak, or how Nip used to rely around tanks and so on. You try to find your own style. You want to try and perfect something through trial and error in scrims, but you want to do it with a purpose, and the purpose isn't to essentially stomp the enemies in scrims. You want to be able to beat yourself. In the end, the toughest competition will be yourself, because when you go into scrims as a typical team and you get stumped by some new strategy or whatever, it might feel tempting to copy that strategy, and a lot of players just copy it straight off and then try to play it as the enemies did in their scrim. But you don't never know if those enemies or opponents in the scrim copied it from someone else, and you have no idea if they actually know how to play it, and you're just copying something blindly. So what does a default strat give to teams? Most teams already know this, but it gives consistency, as I mentioned. And so how do you make one? Well, you take everyone in the team, you sit down and you brainstorm what the team style is. You go to, let's say you pick Hanamura first point attack. You go into the server, you have someone spectating, you have someone running around on, let's say Genji or Widow, whatever, just for easy mobility. And then everyone else is spectating that person, and you have everyone give their input on what they feel is the right thing to do in the current meta, but in the way that they express what they feel is the strongest for them, not what they feel is the strongest in general for everyone that's competing. So you do that for every point. You do that for second point attack, and then you go on defense. You do it for first point defense, second point defense, and then when you have gone through it all, you repeat the information and you make sure that everyone is on the same page. And you have to really make sure that everyone is on the same page, because there's a lot of players that tab out during these sessions and then cause frustration for everyone else. It's unacceptable in my opinion, but it happens and you gotta live with it. And so it means also taking input from players and coaches. So if you're a player and you have the player next to you say something that you might not agree with, you gotta see their perspective, even if you don't like it. You gotta be able to understand how your teammate thinks, because it's not about winning, it's more about evolving. And if you can't see how your teammate thinks outside of the game, you can't really expect how they will behave in game either, and that causes disconnect. And the same goes for coaches. If you're a coach and you're trying to understand your players in game, you gotta be able to understand them outside of the game as well. And that means if a player has input that you might not agree with, or they might not agree with you, you gotta be able to understand why. And it's not about winning, it's, as I said, about evolving. It's similar to having a Rubik's Cube. It's easier to solve it if you can see all sides instead of 2-3 sides and then having to guess the other sides. Maybe it's a bad example, but yeah. So once you have a default strategy on all maps, you want to go into scrims, you want to practice it, you want to repeat the practice, you want to tweak, you want to fine tune it, like small knobs, like on a mixer, and make sure that you try to make as small changes as necessary, and then repeat the process and look in the VOD. Okay, was it a wrong decision, or was it a wrong pick, as in hero pick, or was it a wrong setup, that caused a loss or that caused a win? You want to be able to look at the wins as well. You don't want to skip the VODs where you stomped someone, because it happens that players might not value VODs where they got stomped because they don't feel like going back to their moment and confronting it. But also, they don't want to go back to moments where they stomped someone else because maybe the enemies play bad and like, oh, there's no value in it. But there is value, because you never know if you actually had a really good way of playing, or if it was just the opponent being bad. But it doesn't matter if the opponent is being bad, because if you can see how bad players play against you, you can also take it into the match. You can play more greedy, for example. You can play with more force. And you don't always have to play strict, for example. Sometimes you want to be dominant in game. And if you want to practice that, not only pull it out of your pocket on command without having practiced it before. So having a default strat, it's basically your bread and butter, and you want to start basic, and I mean really basic. For example, the way I do it is I think about chokes a lot, and if you think about it, every fight it starts the same way and it ends the same way. So if you think about taking a fight in a choke, during the fight, that's irrelevant, but the ending of the fight is pretty much the same. And then when I talk with my players, I usually focus on the start of the fight and not that much on the middle part. You want to think about approaching a choke, breaking the choke, and then going for the objective. And when you approach the choke, you want to, let's say you have a scouting route. So you think about the scouting and you make sure you get the information as you walk up to the choke before you engage the enemy. Then you want to have some path to the point, for example, or through the choke, or if you're playing King's Row and the enemy holds by statue, you want to be able to decide, are we gonna fight them, are we gonna run around them, are we gonna run through them, are we gonna go above them, and all that stuff. And if you're playing on Horizon Lunar Colony instead, maybe you don't even have to fight them in that choke. Maybe you just want to run around them, and then you got to think about how you play around the objective after that, because once the choke is broken, you usually move to the point, right? Or you have to take a fight that the enemy intercepts you and you have to take a fight before you get to the point. But securing the objective usually means where the fight starts. So when you think of these steps, it's a simple 1, 2, 3. You have the moment you are before the choke, how you move after through it, and then how you move after it. And once the players engage the fight, they usually are able to adapt to the positioning of the enemies. You can adapt to the abilities, ultimates, etc. Because there are so many factors that play a role, and there's so many scenarios that you might not even be able to account for some stuff. For example, if the enemy picks a hero that you might not expect, if you have planned the fight in complete detail, everything is ruined for you, because that hero is like an unknown factor that changes your plans. So you want to let your players, or not your, but if you're a coach listening, you want to let the players figure out the fight on their own and make sure that they have the tools they need to have to adapt on the fly. They need to be able to analyze the situation with the information they have at hand. For example, that's why you want to be able to plan how you want to move through a choke. This is step 1. You want to set up the scouting and so on. And the information you have before the fight is usually what you use during the fight. So for example, if you're playing on King's Row, you're attacking and there's a Junkrat in lobby, then you keep it in mind when you're fighting. You don't go through the lobby, don't push there, you don't flank there, because the Junkrat will punish you. So when the fight is going on, whatever happens. Usually metas change during the middle part, basically, of a fight. Usually changes drastically depending on the meta. But after a fight, almost every fight ends with a complete team wipe. And you wanna set up positions afterwards, you wanna snowball, all that stuff. And you gotta make sure that you plan for that. And that's when you can have more pre-planned stuff come in. Because if you're attacking, usually you want to snowball, and you can have a set strategy or tactic, whatever, how you want to snowball. Basically, you want to have some type of number of people that runs up, pushes the spawns, and all that. And if we go back to the to the adapt thing during fights, a player. This is something I forgot to mention, but a player that plays with instincts is going to play faster than a player that relies on memorized information, because if you consciously have to pull up a memory that you memorized, you have to process it, you have to decide to execute whatever you learn to react with, and then do it in game, it's going to have a lot more reaction time than someone that relies on instincts and using tools to use the information or the intuition that they have at hand. But yeah, once you have a default strat, you can do all this stuff. And as I mentioned, start basic with these 1, 2, 3 steps, practice it, and then you change whatever you need to change in small increments, and you repeat it, and you repeat it again, and it's gonna stick like the same way Rogue learned how to dive, the same way how Nip played tanks, the same way NOXL played around J. Jonak. It's gonna stick like you're learning how to ride a bike or learning how to swim and so on.